Like I told you last week, we're going to do one now where I don't really have the answer to. I have an answer to it. It may not be the correct answer, and so I've given you all this, and this lines up from Christ's arrest until his death. It kind of puts everything in. I tried to put everything in order so that.
Does it matter the other one in?
Just switch out the hard drive. Well, it'll take it a while. Anyhow, I got to get going here because I got way too much stuff to go through. Well, whether it's recording or not. So anyhow, and no, Galen's going. Galen is starting next week, whether I get finished or not. Okay, so we read in Mark 15:25, and it was the third hour, and they crucified him. Then we see in Mark 15:33, and when the 6th hour is come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. Now, in the book of John, whenever they're going through the trial before Pilate, this is what it says in John 19:14. And it was the preparation of the Passover about the 6th hour, and he said unto the Jews, Behold your king. But they cried out, Away with him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto him, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. Then he delivered him therefore to be crucified, and they took away Jesus and led him away. So what you see here is in Mark 15:25, Jesus was crucified the 3rd hour. And in Mark 15, the 6th hour is whenever darkness, he was hanging on the cross, and Tracy went through the 7 sayings from, so we know about the darkness and so on, and that started in the 6th hour. Well, here in John, he hasn't even been condemned yet, and he says, and it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he saith to the Jews. So, there are all kinds of explanations for this, and I don't agree with any of them that I read, so I made one up on my own. So that's how we're going to go, and I'm not going to say that mine is right. I'm just going to say this is where I'm at right now. So anyhow, some of the explanation, probably the biggest and most popular explanation for this is, according to Roman time, the day ran from midnight to midnight. So they're saying Roman time ran the same way our time runs. So midnight and 1 would be the first hour, 1 in the morning would be the first hour, and so on. The Jewish 24-hour period began in the evening at 6 p.m. and the morning of the day began at 6 a.m. Therefore, when Mark asserts that the 3rd hour Christ was crucified, this was about 9 a.m. John states that Christ's trial was about the 6th hour, meaning Roman time. This would place the trial before the crucifixion, and this would not negate any testimony of the gospel writers. The only problem with that is it does negate what the other gospel writers write, because we read in Luke 22:66, and as soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests and the scribes came together and led him to their council, saying, Art thou the Christ? So then later on in that same day, Luke 23:1, and the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate. So in Luke 22:66 it says, as soon as it was day. Well, no matter how you look at that, because that's not telling you a time, that's telling you as soon as it was day. So what is day? Day is whenever the sun comes up. Well, that would have been about 6 p.m. and even if it was 5 p.m., 6 a.m., I'm sorry. Thank you for that confused look. There's just not enough time. As soon as it was day, the Jews began their trial against Jesus, and after that trial, they led him away to Pilate. So you can't have Pilate at 6 a.m. saying that, saying this final judgment on Jesus. So that time just doesn't work out. That, John, and the second thing is, why would John use Roman time? I mean, that would just be ridiculous for a Jewish writer to use a Gentile time. Then the second most common way of explaining this is the third hour can mean any time between sunrise and mid-morning, or approximately 6 to 9 a.m. The sixth hour can mean any time between mid-morning and noon, or approximately 9 to 12 p.m. The ninth hour can mean any time between noon and mid-evening, approximately 12 to 3 p.m. The 12th hour can mean any time between mid-evening and sunset, or approximately 3 to 6 p.m. So what they're saying is, the Jews, they weren't really very specific about time. And you see this little chart here, and from another guy, he tries to explain all this, and he says that in Mark 13:15, Jesus talks about so we see night from sunset to sunrise, and Jesus divides it into 4 periods. In Mark 13:15, he divides it into evening, midnight, rooster crow, and morning. So they're saying there's how he does it. Well, he says the same thing about day. This would be the third hour, this would be the sixth hour, this would be the ninth hour, this would be the 12th hour. And the Jews, they didn't have watches, and all they could do is look up at the sun and say, well, it must be about this time. And so John looked up at the sun, and he thought, well, it's about the sixth hour. And Mark looked up at the sun and said, well, it's about the third hour. And that just, for that to work, then that would have to work everywhere. And we see that it doesn't work everywhere. In Matthew 26, it says, "And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing idle, and saith unto them, Why stand ye here all day idle?" So we do have the 11th hour. And he's not talking generalities. We have the 11th hour. In John 1:39, he says, "Come and see. They came and saw where he dwelt, and abode with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour." So, and here it is kind of a generality. He says it was about the 10th hour. So, if you're going to use generalities, but it was the 10th hour, not the 9th hour. So you're not using those 3 hours and counting them as just one section. John 4:52, "They inquired he them of the hour when he began to amend, and he said unto him, Yesterday at the 7th hour the fever left him." So again, we have a specific time. We don't have a generality. We have a specific time. And then Jesus answered and said, "Are there not 12 hours in a day?" So Jesus says, he's not saying, are there not 4 sections in the day, 4 times in the day? Are there not 12 hours in the day? So I think we'd have to reject that, just because you can't always make generalities unless a generality is given to you in Scripture. Then now I could go on for 2 hours with all the different explanations, and it's just so. Here's another one. And this is not me speaking. I copied and pasted this from the internet. I believe that when we put all the scriptures together that tell us of the events that happened from the time the Lord Jesus was first arrested in the morning hours till the time Pilate finally presents him before the Jewish multitude in the open squares and says, "Behold, your king," was 6 hours. So what he's saying is, from the time of Jesus' arrest until Pilate finally sits down in the judgment seat, that took 6 hours, and that's why he said, and it was about the 6th hour. Well, the problem with that is, if that would mean that they had to have arrested Jesus sometime between like 1:30 and 2:30 in the morning. And I just don't believe that's realistic. I don't believe that they were just out there hanging out, and they were going to hang out all night and waiting for him to be arrested. So I don't believe that that's accurate either. So for me, and I'll just go through a little bit of the process I went through of trying to figure this out, and some of my wrong conclusions. And my first wrong conclusion was we're always supposed to compare scriptural things with scriptural things. So I thought, where else is the phrase "about the sixth hour" used? Well, it's used in these four places. Luke 23:44. And it was about the sixth hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the ninth hour. Then John 4:6, and Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat on the well and said, and it was about the sixth hour. And then the verse that we had looked at, and it was a preparation of the Passover about the sixth hour, and he said unto the Jews, behold your king. Then in Acts 10:9, whenever Peter is about to go to Cornelius is about to come to Peter. On the morrow, as they went on their journey and drew nigh to the city, Peter went up upon the housetop to pray about the sixth hour. And I thought, well, every time you see the sixth hour here, something's going to change, because in Luke 23:44, it was about the sixth hour, and there was darkness over the earth until the ninth hour. That's when Jesus is hanging on the cross, and so payment for sins is about to be made, so something's going to change. John 4:6, this is whenever Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman at the well, and he sits down at the well, and it's about the sixth hour. Well, what's about to change there is Jesus is going to go to the Samaritans, which before he had only, he had told his disciples, go not into this, don't go to the Samaritans, just go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So that's something different. And then in Acts 10:9, whenever Peter goes up to pray about the sixth hour, well, he's about to talk to Cornelius, and he's going to be going to the Gentiles, which was going to be something new. And then another one, by implication, in Acts 22:6, and when this is Paul talking, and he's recounting his on the road to Damascus, and he says, and it came to pass that as I made my journey and was come nigh unto Damascus, about noon suddenly there shone from heaven a light around me. So that's now something is going to change again, and it's about noon, which is about the sixth hour in Jewish time. So Paul is going to be saved, so that's going to be another change. And then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, I'm kind of making the same kind of stretches that everybody else is making, and I don't think that's quite accurate. So I went back to the drawing board and I looked up hour, and whenever you look up hour in the Greek, you have this little Greek thingy, and it tells you what it's supposed to mean in Greek. And then you look in the Webster's 1828 dictionary, and the descriptions from the Greek to the English match up pretty well. And in Webster's dictionary, an hour is a space of time equal to 1/24th part of the natural day or duration of time, or time, a particular time, as in the hour of death. So hour can mean 1/24th of a day, or an hour. It can mean an exact time, like, this is his hour, it's his time, or it can mean a particular period of time. And the particular period of time we can see in John 17:1, whenever Jesus is in the garden with his disciples and he's praying. This is part of his prayer. Then these words spake Jesus, and lifted his eyes up to heaven and said, Father, the hour is come. Glorify thy Son, that thy Son may glorify thee. Well, Jesus is in the garden. Within 1 hour, he's not hanging on the cross, but he says the hour is come. And even as far back as John 12, a couple days before that, he says that the hour is come. So that it's a kind of a particular period of time. So From there, when I was reading through John's Gospel again, I noticed for the first time, and I had never really noticed this before, how many times, because the Jews, whenever they presented Jesus to Pilate, they wouldn't go into the judgment hall because they didn't want to sully themselves. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover, so they couldn't go into the judgment hall. And so they took him, sent him into Pilate. Pilate comes out, talks to them. He goes back in, talks to Jesus, comes back out, talks to the Jews. I had never realized that this happens again and again and again and again, and I thought, well, maybe that has something to do with that. Maybe it's like the 6th time he talks to Pilate or something. But still, it wasn't quite clicking. And from that, though, that's where this was born, because I thought, if I go through here and I line up everything, we'll be able to see, how many times he was judged before Pilate and so on. And by doing this, I also noticed some things that I had known, but I had never really thought about before. John is the only book that never mentions the darkness from the 6th hour to the 9th hour. The other 3 books all mention the darkness from that time. And John's account of the crucifixion gives you less detail about what happens to Jesus on the cross. It talks about who's standing around the cross, what they're doing with his garments, but it gives you almost no detail at all of what's actually happening to Jesus on the cross. But then John gives the most information about Jesus' trial before the Gentile powers. If it wasn't for Luke telling you about Jesus being sent to Herod, then by far John has the most information about Jesus being tried before the Gentile powers. And that John didn't mention the physical darkness is kind of in line with the book of John, because John presents Jesus as light. So he didn't mention the darkness because Christ is light. Just a thought there, which may or may not be right. But in John 1:4, whenever he's first introduced, in Jesus, talking about Jesus, in him was life, and the life was the light, and the light shineth in darkness, and darkness comprehended it not. So keep that in mind, and also keep in mind that the book of John presents Jesus Christ as being God. Now, for the benefit of you that weren't here for our first lesson on these difficult verses, you're not going to see the relevance of this right away, and you may never see the relevance of it, but our first lesson was about the ages of Ahaziah and the ages of Jehoiachin. So we're just going to review this as quickly as I possibly can, but in 2 Kings 8:25, in the 12th year of Joram the son of Ahab, king of Israel, did Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, began to reign. 22 years old was Ahaziah when he began to reign. Then you look at 2 Chronicles 22, and down in verse 2, 42 years old was Ahaziah when he began to reign. His mother's name also was Athaliah. That's Athaliah, the daughter of Omri. She was actually Ahab's daughter, but he points her back to being the daughter of Omri. So when we studied this, you remember the 16-foot timeline we had back taped to the wall. Yeah, and I brought some mini copies of that. If you want to look at it, they're laying on the back table back there if you just want to look at this later on. But what we saw is in the book of Kings, he's giving his actual physical age. He was 22 years old when he began to reign. But this was the kingship of Israel, the northern king. This was the kingship of Judah, which was the Davidic line. Now Omri was the most wicked king in Israel up until that time, up until his son Ahab took over. Then he was even more wicked than his father. Well, Jehoshaphat was a righteous king in Judah. His son Jehoram married the daughter of Athaliah, and from there polluted the line of David with this line of Omri. This line began with Omri. And we see here in 2 Chronicles 22:2, his mother's name also was Athaliah. And if you read the whole thing, you'll see how wicked she was. But anyhow, it polluted the Davidic line. And so whenever he says his mother's name also was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri, he's saying she's from way back here. So whenever we looked at that chart and we went through some verses, and we showed that from the time, the year that Ahaziah became king, 42 years before that was whenever Omri became king. So the spiritual age of Ahaziah, because he was linked to Omri rather than being linked to David, he was linked to this lineage of Omri, so his spiritual age then was 42 years. So in 2 Kings we get his physical age, and then in 2 Chronicles we get his spiritual age, because he's being linked back to Omri. He's not being linked back to David because he had mixed his blood with the blood of the evil kings up there. Now then, 2 Chronicles 36:9. Jehoiachin was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem, and did that evil in the sight of the Lord. In 2 Kings 24:8, Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. And his mother's name was Nehushta, the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem. So again, we have 2 Chronicles is going to give you a spiritual age, and 2 Kings is going to give you the physical age. Jehoiachin was 18 years old physically when he began to reign. But if you look in 2 Kings 24 and verse 11, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the city, and his servants did besiege it. And Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants and his princes and his officers. And the king of Babylon took him in the 8th year of his reign. It was the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Whenever he only reigned 3 months, this Jehoiachin only reigned 3 months. So he became king in the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and he was carried away in the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And the 8th year, it had been 8 years since whenever Josiah died, Israel was never a independent monarchy again. Egypt took over for 4 years, then Nebuchadnezzar took over for 4 years, and then, so it had been 8 years, but it was also now, it was the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, so now the Bible is telling you Jehoiachin was 8 years old when he began to reign. He's saying that kingship was only 8 years, because now he's putting Judah, he's putting them spiritually into the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. So spiritually now, Nebuchadnezzar had been reigning 8 years. So now when Jehoiachin began to reign spiritually, Israel is only 8 years old. They've been taken captivity, and it's 8 years since that. And I know this is way too quick for you, but if you have any questions, you can either go read the stuff online or look at the chart or ask me afterwards. But the reason I bring that up is that there is precedent in God's Word that whenever you have two numbers that look like they just aren't reconcilable, sometimes it's a spiritual number. Sometimes you have to look and see it's a spiritual number and not a physical number. So now just whenever we look at the book of John and how the book of John was written, I'm just going to read a verse, and then I'm going to ask you about something, and whether it was spiritual or physical. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Is the light and the darkness physical or spiritual? Spiritual. John 3:7. Marvel not that I say unto thee, ye must be born again. Is the new birth physical or spiritual? And Jesus saith unto whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again. Whosoever drinketh of... Okay, I got the wrong verse, but then in the next verse he says, whosoever drinketh of the water that I give him shall never thirst again. So is that water spiritual or physical? Spiritual. Okay. John 6:54. Whosoever eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood hath eternal life, and I will raise him at the last day. Flesh and blood. Did you have to eat Jesus? No, it's spiritual. Okay, unless you're Catholic, yeah. Then John 7:38. He that believeth on me, as Scripture has said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. Water again. Physical or spiritual? Spiritual. So, and all through John, you have this happening. He's giving you something that is physical, and he's relating it to you as a spiritual thing. So, when we get then to John 19:13 and 14, when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. And it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he said unto the Jews, behold your king. So, Pilate comes out. He has gone in and out a number of times. He's taken him to Herod. And now finally the Jews are threatening him about Caesar. You know, if you let this guy live, he's, you know, you're going against Caesar. So finally Pilate sits down in the judgment seat, and I think that's important. Pilate is now in the judgment seat. And then there's 3 ands. And it was the preparation of the Passover. So the Passover was physical, but was it also spiritual? Had the Passover been fulfilled yet? The true Passover? No, Christ had not died. So it was also the preparation of the spiritual Passover. And then he says unto them, behold your king. Now, is Jesus Christ going to be king? Yeah. Yes, he is. He's going to physically be king. But at that point, was he spiritually their king? No. Well, I would say he was. He is their king. He's their king, whether they like it or not. He is their king, and all those that came to him, he was their king. But these are rejecting their king. And then he gets to and I also think that whenever Pilate sits down, he's on the judgment seat, and when he says, behold your king, a lot of people say, well, he was just making this nasty, sarcastic comment. I believe that he was saying this. He might not have even realized what he was saying, but he's on the judgment seat, and he's telling Israel, behold your king. This is your king. And I don't care whether he was saying it with a sarcastic attitude, but when you read through the context of the whole thing, I don't see any sarcasm. I think he was really afraid. And he says, behold your king. I think he's telling Israel, this is your king. So it was the preparation of the physical and spiritual Passover. It was their physical and spiritual king, and about the 6th hour. And once again, I think this speaks both physically and spiritually. Spiritually, okay, let's see. If you look on page 5, let me see. I have that written down here, don't I? Page 13. Yeah, on page 13. If you look on page 13 of this thing here, of the fancy dancy, and you see how Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all lined up there. And it says, I'll just read Matthew because they all pretty much say the same thing. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land unto the 9th hour. So I believe, now this is just what I have right now. If anybody has a better answer, I'm open to it. But right now, I think that when John says, first he says, it's the physical, and it's a physical and literal preparation, physical and spiritual preparation of the Passover. Christ is their physical and spiritual king. Now this is spiritually, I think, when he says, and it was about the 6th hour, I think he wrote this after the fact. I think he's referring back to these verses and saying, now this is whenever the spiritual darkness fell on Israel. This is the 6th hour relates over to these verses in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where it was the physical darkness, but he's relating it over now. And he's saying this is whenever the spiritual darkness completely fell on Israel. And whenever I was talking about how many times he was judged before the Gentile powers, if you look starting on page 5 of your little handout here, boy, come on now, ladies, you complain about turning to the Bible, now you're complaining about turning to the little handout. Okay. You see these that are highlighted in yellow. Every place where you see they're highlighted in yellow is whenever the Jews were condemning Jesus before the Gentile powers. And the first time up here in John on the top of page 5, that is the end of whenever they were accusing him to Pilate. And it gives you the reason they were accusing him to Pilate. It is not lawful for us to put any man to death. So they had to go to the Gentile powers because they wanted to kill Christ. And under Roman law, they couldn't do it. So there's the first time. And then if you just flip through there, up until, you will see, up until we get to John 19:14 on page 9, you have 6 times that the Jews have condemned Jesus to the Gentile powers that can put him to death. In John 19:12, and from thenceforth Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. And then we have, he goes to the judgment seat, he sits down, and he says, Behold your king. Now for the 7th time, but they cried out, Away with him, crucify him. So that's the 7th time. And what do we know about 7 in Scripture? It's completion. It's perfect completion. That was the 7th time they had accused him. And so I believe also physically, whenever he talks about hour, he's talking about a particular period of time. And that particular period of time was the accusations that the Jews were making against him to the Gentile powers. And whenever he says in John 19:14, and about the 6th hour, that was about the 6th time they had condemned him, and then finally the 7th time they condemn him, and he releases him, and he goes away. Yeah, boy, I really got real far off my notes. So if you want to read what I really think, go ahead and read notes, because they're much better than what I just said. But so it is my thought, and I don't think my answer is any more far out than anybody else's answer. I know it seems more far out, but we do have precedent in the Bible whenever you have 2 numbers that seem to be irreconcilable. One of those numbers often is the way that God is looking at things and not the way that man is looking at things. And so I believe, and since the book of John is presenting Jesus Christ as God, I think this is the way God is looking at things. It's the 6th hour, and what happened at the 6th hour? There was darkness across the land. At this 6th hour, that's the darkest Israel ever got, was at this 6th hour, and that spiritual darkness. And then the physical part of it was the 6th time, it was the 6th period in which they had condemned Jesus, and so that's my thing. And also, one thing also, while I was doing this, I was laying in bed one night, and this thought popped into my head, and I had to get out of bed and go out and look at it. So Tracy had just done 7 sayings from the cross, and what is really interesting as an addendum in the back of this, if you as an addendum to what Tracy preached about, if you look at Matthew as king, Mark as servant, Luke as man, and John as God, and then you look at what Jesus said on the cross, comparing them, it really, I think that really brings something else out, something special that I had never seen before until I thought of that one night when I was doing all this in my head. But is there any, I know there's probably hundreds of questions, and like I said, if you have, this is for your study to help you tell me why I'm wrong. So is there any questions or comments or?
Your reasoning for why it wasn't just the 6th hour of all these events was basically just because that would put the trial and everything at 2 or 3 in the morning.
Yeah, and actually, like Bollinger says that and it couldn't have been in the morning because all 4 Gospels say, when morning came. And then in Luke it says as soon as it was day, and so they didn't have this, and I think Luke is the chronologically right. I think if you follow what Luke says, and that's why I change, I moved some stuff. This stuff that is in the brown, that's stuff that has been moved just to line up with Luke. And Luke says as soon as it was day, then the Sanhedrin got together, and that's when the trial began. So, yeah, I don't think that, because none of those ones really satisfy me, and I think that a lot of times, whenever we only look at for physical explanations, we might miss something that might be a real truth. But it says, and the whole thing about these people saying that it was just, they didn't have exact times or anything, but God wrote the book of John, and God knows exact time, and God put that 6th hour in there for a reason, and just he didn't put it in there just to confuse us, although it does, but he put it in there for a reason. And I think that it's important that we try to understand that reason, and even if I don't have that right, I think that there is a specific reason why it is there, and to me, the spiritual darkness makes the most sense to me. So.
Considered it's possibly more than one day because the trial, the actual crucifixion, starting first thing in the morning the next day.
No, it couldn't have happened that way because when you just read through the accounts, it was the preparation day, and so.
Passover, the preparation day of Passover.
Yeah. So.
But there were events going on the whole night before the crucifixion. Right?
Yeah, they were, and you see them.
But the Jewish trial and all was during the night.
No, it wasn't. If you read, let's see. What you have going on during the night is they take him to Annas. And then when it's day, then because Annas was like there were like two high priests. Annas was like the vice high priest, and they take him to Annas, and all this happens, and then they deliver him to the high priest, because it says as soon as it was day, they took counsel how to put him to death, and
That's after all that stuff happens, after they bring false witnesses against him, after the cock crows, after all that.
yeah. You just
The cock crow.
what? In the morning.
Yeah,
In the morning.
right, so all that stuff with Caiaphas and all happened before that. In Matthew 26.
I don't really think it did. I think that you can shut it off. Yeah, shut it off. We'll just argue.